our slides there, so we can get the webinar started. Bear with me. So we'll be talking about the neuroscience of learning. Now, when we are, there are some slides where you will actually see, you know, the structure of the brains and how it works and so forth. But every part of this session, I want us to think about how does this relate to our classroom planning, and how does it, you know, how do we actually make sure that we are strategically changing or adapting the ways that we are looking at the way our brain actually connects to technology when it comes to learning, because the ultimate goal of this process is to ensure that we have more awareness or understanding as to which technology we should be choosing, what will really benefit for our students because it actually works in synergy with the way that our brain processes information, as opposed to perhaps, you know, some technology that where you basically have, you know, texts on screen. So it hasn't fundamentally changed the way that our students actually process information. So as a brief background, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about, you know, why or how I got to talk about this topic, so the neuroscience of learning. I actually started my professional life trained in biomedical science here in Australia, and during my degree, I also spent some time tutoring primary and secondary students in mathematics. So after a few years, after I graduated from uni, I started working in research and development in the field. I then decided to combine my passion in education and science. Then I started working in publishing with McGraw-Hill and Pearson. And of course, publishing, you know, textbooks, and there was a starting of the rise of using more technology. But then I came across Manga High. So I joined Manga High in 2012, where I entered this fascinating world of EdTech. So I now work with teachers to really, I guess, synthesize information in cognitive science and gather that information and work out how we can bring that into classroom, especially in the context of using technology. So we all feel that, you know, technology has disrupted the education sector. I mean, the reality is, I want to start by saying technology is here to stay. Our children in their personal life, or perhaps in their, you know, in their personal life and of course in their school life as well, they have access to many different platforms and devices. You know, as a minimum, if they don't have access to technology at home, they are aware, at the very least, aware of how technology can bring excitement, and are constantly curious about what else technology can bring for them. Now, in education, of course, as teachers, you're constantly bombarded by the multitudes of platforms and solutions that, you know, claim to solve the problem of teaching, solve the problem of boredom, so, you know, better than the traditional methods. So like I said, in this session, I want us to become more critical about how to evaluate e-learning platforms for its value, so that we can distinguish between those that are, you know, essentially a hype, as opposed to those that seriously change the way our students, you know, engage with learning. Okay, let's start by today. Let's also start today by thinking about, you know, what is that definition of learning? You know, what does that mean in terms of how does technology support us in better learn? So how does technology work in synergy with the way our brain naturally learn, and therefore how our brain makes decisions on what information to absorb and keep, as opposed to information that's not required, and therefore, you know, it just gets lost into that brain ether. So the reality is we need to think about, okay, how does our brain function, and therefore, again, how do you manipulate and adapt your teaching so that more information is actually kept? Because what we have come to do for many, many years is this sort of information dump in our brain. You know, we keep feeding it to students and feeding it to students, and then we later find out through tests or through exams that, you know, only a very small proportion of it it actually lands in long-term memory or actually is absorbed. So as a starting point, I really like this definition of learning, and in this case, they've talked about firstly, it's a transformative process of taking in the information, and then once that information is internalized and mixed with what we have already experienced in the past, so in other words, past memories, that changes and builds upon who we are today. So it's based on input, and then there's a process of, actually turning it into a memory, whether it be short-term, medium, long-term memory, and then it's through a process of reflection. And ultimately, what happens is that it changes us. So that change is growth. And that's what we are all about, is wanting to make sure that, you end the journey better than, or having more information than when you first started, basically. Okay, so through neuroscience research, what we do know is that brain cells, when we learn, actually physically and chemically change. So it's this idea of neuroplasticity. So what that means is our brains can actually make new connections as we experience and internalize information. That stored information can then be recalled. So we recollect old information so that we can build upon it, so that we can grow. So learning is all about making connections rather than simply collecting discrete or unrelated packets of data or information in our brain. Everything is connected, and we're constantly checking in to see what do we already know and what don't we know, and then evaluate, what growth is. Let's have a look and observe this child solving the Rubik's Cube. All right, I want us to take note of how quickly he does it. And more importantly, we're not examining each stage. There is almost, a quick examination, and then you move on and you decide on what algorithms to implement. So each step is almost very reactive. And perhaps even look at that facial expression, that sense of reward at the end of, once they've solved the problem. But what's really fascinating is that there is this sense of every combination is not a problem in itself. It's a trigger for a series of algorithms that can be implemented in our that can be implemented to solve the next step, basically. Okay. Sorry, my internet connection is slowing down a little bit, I can see. I hope you can all still hear me, so I'll keep moving forward. But what I wanted to show is that what we have just observed in these students, or in that child, is actually implementing these algorithms. So really executing the relevant algorithm based on the current state of the cube. So now if you can imagine getting all our kids or our students in the context of learning, memorizing, textbooks, pages, and problem-solving questions, and processes and fluency questions, and just get them to keep working through those without actually practicing and looking at, inputs and outputs. It's a very difficult task, because it may not necessarily, lead to understanding. So what we're saying is that in order for these algorithms, or the mathematics algorithms, to be implemented and remembered, our kids actually need to practice. Okay, and through this practice, it becomes fast and it becomes reactive, and most importantly, it actually becomes involuntary and then automatic for our kids. And that's where it becomes really amazing. So what happens is these algorithms, similar to mathematics lessons that your students have learned from, a 3-year-old through to a 15, 16, and into adulthood, these algorithms are actually stored in long-term memory, or we sometimes call it muscle memory. The working memory, on the other hand, or conversely from long-term memory, is actually very limited in capacity. It's where we learn. We will learn more about it, but it's where we process information, but we want more information to come from our long-term memory. So the more we can store into our long-term memory, or the automation part of our processes, the more efficient our brain can actually operate. And ultimately, the more higher order thinking problems we can solve, and this, which is where we ultimately want our students to get to, being able to use the mathematics that they have learned or the skills that they have learned and actually use them to solve higher order thinking real world problems as well. Okay, so let's think about how, or break it down, how we form memories. To begin with, to form a single memory, we need to start by, acknowledging or perceiving that an event has happened, right? Once you've interpreted it, then you encode it. You make that decision to actually say, okay, well, is it something that I want to remember? And you encode it. We then maintain that information for a brief moment of processing. And like I said, if you deem that information to be useful or interesting, then we begin that attentional process, deliberate process of consolidating it and storing it. This is the bit that results in the physical and chemical changes in our brain, and we'll have a look at it in more detail as we progress. And later, when we need to recall it in a discussion, then we can, retrieve it and we can build upon it. And when we do that, what we're doing is we're actually searching into the back of our mind and pulling the information forward and activating the pathways forward into the forward part of your mind in order to process it. So keeping it simple, it's important to note that there are, two general types of memory that we can talk about. There is that working memory, and for precisely what the word means, it's actually conscious work that needs to be used in working memory. And then there is the long-term memory, which is, really fundamental. So the idea of working versus long-term memory is that fundamental to understand how cognitive science can actually be applied into your teaching and learning. So if you think about long-term memory, it's like a storage box. Theoretically, it's unlimited in capacity. So theoretically, we can store unlimited amount of information for an entire lifetime. On the other hand, the working memory is the processing unit where we process and manipulate information to solve problems. And like I said, it has very limited in capacity. Okay, but then that's the memory side of things. So what about actually understanding what those memory means? So putting some meaning behind those memories. So what happens is, in the very first stage of forming a new memory, the first thing we do when we get an input is we look at it, we look at that, or we interpret that event, and we say, is this something that I already know, or is it something new? So it finds that delta in our brain effectively. And the next stage is then it makes a decision, and if it understands that piece of information, it then gives meaning to it. When it comes to giving meaning to it, what we're actually doing is, where does it fit into the information that we already know? So creating an association or a linkage to existing memory or knowledge, okay? And then, if we go further than that, just from understanding, in terms of creating long-term memory, we want to not just understand the meaning of something, because it still doesn't guarantee that we will remember it for a long time. In fact, to go from understanding to mastering, we actually need to use that knowledge over and over again. So repetition, okay? So now while we have talked about working memory, which is where we process information, and of course long-term memory where we store it, we want to think about, how do we go from processing a piece of information, then memorizing it, to actually understand it and being able to use it and adapt it and borrow it. And so in other words, how do we know to recall the correct information? How do we know that it is associated correctly in our mind in order for us to be able to recall it effectively for future problem solving? Okay, so given that, let's go into that whole neuroscience process of what actually happens in our brain when we learn. To begin with, let's talk about the structure of the brain. So the brain's cerebral cortex, which is that sort of the outermost layer, is what gives the brain that whole characteristic wrinkly appearance. So there's there's the higher part of the brain, and then there's the lower part in the creases, and all of those sections are divided lengthways into two hemispheres. So your left and right hemisphere that we all hear about, and these hemispheres are then divided into four lobes. You have the frontal lobe, then the parietal lobe. So the frontal lobe is, as the name suggests, it's right in front of your brain, just behind your forehead. And your parietal lobe is just above and sort of the top back part of your brain. And you have the occipital lobe is kind of, right above your neck, if you wish. And then your temporal lobe is kind of inside, so right in the middle. Now, each lobe has its own separate functions, and of course they're all related. But if you think about the frontal lobe, it is generally where that higher order executive functions, things like emotional regulation. So, if you're getting very angry about something and you're telling yourself to calm down, you're using your frontal lobe to do that. If you're feeling unmotivated and you're telling yourself to, no, you know what, step up, let's go to the gym, that's your frontal lobe doing its work. Okay. It's used for planning, it's used for reasoning, it's used for problem solving. So the frontal lobe is located in the front part of your brain, and it's also the largest of the four main lobes, and it's considered that emotional control center. And it's also regarded as the home to our personality and decision-making abilities. The frontal lobe are also linked to, other sensory and memory centers throughout the brain, and allows us to determine how to use information that is stored elsewhere. Okay, so it is that decision-making part of our brain. To put simply, it allows us to think things through and rationalize, the rational part of our brain, decision-making. So when I share this, I will actually share this slide deck with you all, by the way, and it will have these links to YouTube videos that explains to you further the function of each lobe, and how it fits into the way that we action things and the way that we form our personalities as well. Then you have the parietal lobe, which is, like I said, it's kind of the top back part of your brain, and this is where this is the area of the brain that's really responsible for integrating or merging information. So it takes information from a number of different parts of our brain. So it also has sensory inputs, for example, touch, temperature, pressure, and pain. And it's really looks at a lot of different pieces of information and actually integrates it into something that we can discern. Okay, so one part of the parietal lobe is all about sensation and perception, and the other part is about integrating the sensory input primarily into the visual system. Now, it is also where we construct a spatial coordinate system to represent the world around us. So what that means is that the parietal lobe is responsible for understanding your own physical presence, where your arm is relative to your head, to your body, and making sure that when you're walking, you're not walking to the corner or stubbing your toe. You're constantly aware. Okay. It also looks at the visual process of our environment. So it's really it's useful for, sorry, not useful, but it is that place where you're reading, or your ability to visualize what you're reading comes from the parietal lobe as well. Okay, we use the parietal lobe to focus, to create attentional processes, to represent numbers, to represent an idea, and so this is the very really important space that connects your long short-term memory as well as any other sensory information that's coming into your brain. Now, the occipital lobe, again, remember this is at the back center of your brain. It is the major visual processing part of your brain. It's the primary region that receives visual information from your eyes. So this information then is relayed, of course, to different parts of your brain, for example, the parietal lobe, as we've discussed, which is then interpreted in depth. And it's also the place where, using that visual information, we interpret our distance, our location, the identity of an object, who it is. So basically, in summary, the occipital lobe really deals with a lot of aspects of our life that is connected to vision. So, for example, we use vision, of course, to work out how far something is, so depth perception, the distance. We use the occipital lobe, our eyes, to determine color, to recognize an object, to work out our movement, to even recognize face, for example. And of course, ultimately, it all contributes to that memory formation, okay? Which the memory formation actually happens in the temporal lobe. So this is in the bottom middle part of your brain. It processes sensory information, particularly important for hearing, recognizing language, and of course forming memories. The temporal lobe contains the primary auditory cortex. So it receives information, auditory information from the ears, and processes the information that we understand. So things like, processes the information that we're hearing. So things like words and crying and laughing. All of these things forms memory, okay, contributes to forming memory. And in certain areas of the temporal lobe, it's also used to make sense of very complex visual information. For example, the faces and scenes around us, okay? But more importantly, in the context of what we are covering today, we're going to be looking at specifically the medial temporal lobe, where the hippocampus is contained, and that is the region for memory. And right next to the hippocampus is a part of our brain called the amygdala, which deals with emotions and feelings. And there is evidence in terms of, if we look at the actual cross-section of these regions, you'll find that there is actually high levels of neural connections. So there are physical changes, there is neural density that happens in the hippocampus when we practice and when we learn information, okay? So, like I said, the hippocampus is in that sort of the medial center part of your brain. It plays an important role in consolidating information from short-term to long-term memory, and of course in spatial recognition as well. But without proper consolidation, what you're finding is that information that is perceived, so visuals that are interpreted, information auditory-wise that is heard, that doesn't actually get learnt or memorized or doesn't get committed into memory unless the hippocampus actually consolidates it and we practice it and we hear it repeatedly, or at least your brain, processes it repeatedly. So in order for memory to occur, the hippocampus region needs to make sure that there is a structure. So structurally or physically, there is a change in the hippocampus in order for that memory to form. So to form genuine long-term memory, what we are saying is that we need repetition and association. So what that means is that we are building and anchoring a network of related information into the neural networks, okay? So we can store episodic memory, which is based on events that actually occurred and therefore we interpreted it. So your eyes interpreted an event, your ears heard the experience from the event. So that's an episode. So that's an episodic memory. Or alternatively, it can also store semantic memories, which is based on facts and information that other people might have interpreted or might have relayed to you, or you might have read in the book. Okay, so let's have a look at the next few slides. I want us to when I do this in a room, I normally get people to put their hands up in order to answer the question. So the plan is I'm going to give you a set of questions, and I want you to just in your heart, in your honest heart, feel how quickly you can answer these questions. And we'll talk about, from a brain science point of view, what's actually happened when you're answering these questions. All right, so are we ready? Let's go. So 2 times 2. We all instinctively answered 4 within a nanosecond, I bet. Okay, so it was very quick for us to actually recall this answer. What about this one? That was pretty quick too. Okay, so remember, we interpret, or we can answer these pretty quickly because we have experienced it. 7 times 2, we've experienced it many times. What about this one? So for those of us who know our 4 times table, again, very quick, 28. But if you think about a 5-year-old child who might not have learnt and experienced an array of 4s, they might consider using the 2 times tables in order to then double that in order to turn it into a 4 times tables. So it takes some manipulative work. It uses and expend the working memory in order for them to work out these answers. But if we want to avoid using that working memory, we of course need to free it up by memorizing it and automating it. What about this one? So pretty easy one for most of us, but you'd be surprised how many kids don't know 7 times 8 is 56. So again, while these are very, very simple questions, I want us to think about as your students progress into harder level maths, what does it mean if they don't automate the lower level maths, if they don't commit the lower level maths into long-term memory and understand it, then it makes it really hard for us to teach them, you know, logarithmic thinking. It's very hard for us to teach them calculus if they don't know the basic manipulations of their basic algebra, for example. So it's very important that we are achieving mastery before we allow students to progress. Okay, what about the next one? How about this? Okay. Did anyone get the answer? Let's talk about what we experienced. What just happened in our brain when we saw 17 times 24? Okay. So most of us would have started retrieving some information from our long-term memory in your temporal lobe. The parietal lobe would have started gathering some information about what you already know about this problem, sifted through which processes you may consider using to solve this problem. You might then start thinking about some calculations in your frontal lobe. You know, which calculation do you want to work out? 7 times 20, 7 times 4, what that might be, or perhaps you want to do 20 times 25 and then manipulate it from there. Okay, whatever process you have in mind, you think about what's the best way of doing it, or perhaps you want to just pull out your pen and paper and do it the old school way. That's completely fine as well. Or ultimately, you might say maybe not. Michelle is likely to reveal the answer anyway. So what's the point of answering this question on a Saturday morning? Okay. Physiologically, what would have happened is that your muscles would have tensed up. Your blood pressure would have rose just a tiny little bit, your heart rate might have increased a little bit, and your pupils would have dilated to attention. Okay. What you notice is that question, 17 times 24, is not as easy as 2 times 2. Doesn't come to you quickly, but you know what to work out or how to work it out. Okay. So for those of us who needs closure, 17 times 24 is 408. But what I wanted us to discuss is this idea of the psychologists describes our brain as having 2 systems of thinking. Okay, we just experienced both systems of thinking in the last 2 or 3 minutes. The first few questions, you know, 4 times 7, 2 times 2, 2 times 7, that was very fast, effortless thinking. It was almost subconscious thinking as well. You kind of, you know, just pulled it out from somewhere and you don't know where it came from. It's automatic. It's your instinct almost. It looks for patterns and causation. So it sees 2 times 2 and it knows the result is 4 straight away. It's very straightforward, cause and effect. Okay. It's also what we call declarative memory. So in other words, it's that memory in your long-term memory that you simply pull out, extract and declare an answer, and that's it. And then you leave that question behind. And so what it happens is that it reconnects the hippocampal and frontal circuits. So it gets information from the hippocampus, it then pulls into your frontal lobe, and it then says, okay, that is the answer. All right. If it gets any more complicated than that, it might dig into the hippocampus again, get some more information, and then puts it into your frontal lobe and says, okay, that is the answer, and this is how it's related. However, it also forms associative memory. It also looks at where have I recognized this before. It's looking at binding new and old information together. But the whole purpose of it is if it was something new, then it will bind the new to the old and add to, you know, long-term memory through generalization. So it looks for recognition. And then when we came to the harder question, 17 times 24, what we experienced was slow thinking. So that thinking, you would have noticed, is that it required effort. It was a lot more conscious, a lot more deliberate, okay, and takes time and effort and energy. But more importantly, it can lead to fatigue and can only be sustained for a short period of time. So when we saw 17 times 24, it may also feel too hard. So it might feel too hard because it was being compared to 2 times 2 or 4 times 7. But especially if you didn't know what process you could use. So imagine a 5-year-old child encountering 17 times 24. They wouldn't know what process to use. So it would have taken up so much of their working memory just to solve that problem. Okay, so the whole point of this is, again, it's using working memory. So the working memory is anchored in that parietal frontal circuits. So the working memory creates a short-term representation of an event, and that allows for manipulation of multiple discrete quantities over several seconds. So very, very limited. While recent neuroimaging actually studies have highlighted the role of the parietal lobe in this process, no one actually really knows completely yet how the process works. But what we do know is that the parietal lobe is involved with remembering visual information, motor spatial attention, and as well as that sort of attentional information as well. But what we do know is the working memory, because it's a much more complicated process, it's very limited in its capacity. So you can't be working out difficult problem-solving tasks over and over again because your brain gets tired. So when we give our students higher order thinking tasks, what that means is that we need to make sure that we teach our students enough strategies for them to be able to solve higher order problems. Because when we are solving a problem-solving task at school, you use both memory systems. You use the long-term memory system, so your system 1, to pull out as much information as you already know relating to that problem, and then you use your working memory to manipulate that, okay? So what we have found is that there is this growing evidence to suggest that these functional circuits is very different in kids, in children, compared to in adulthood. Because in adults, we know that we have over a lot of experience through school and education, we've developed multiple strategies for learning and for solving problems. Whereas children are more immature in their problem-solving abilities, which means, especially your students that are just starting to learn, when they are given a problem, they break it down into much more smaller basic or basic components in order to solve it. So the use of these really basic strategies requires a greater reliance on working memory for problem solving. So for example, children will actually rely more on counting strategies during simple arithmetic problem solving, and therefore they need to access the multiple working memory components in order to solve these problems. So they might be using their short-term storage, they might be using their rule-based manipulation storage, updating, and then they update the stored contents before they can grow from it again. So what that means is, if we can, as we grow, as we educate our students, as they progress from class 1 to class 2 to class 3 and so forth, we need to look at strategies in our classrooms to shift from rule-based manipulations to fact retrieval strategies. So the more our students can rely on their memory, the better and more efficient it is for them to solve problems. And in terms of memory, we all know our experience with driving. So as adults, if we always relate to this reduction of load or workload in the working memory when we become this accomplished driver. Okay, so if you look back into your life, think about the first time you started to learn to drive. The number of things back then that you would have needed to actively pursue and instruct yourself. At the start, you would have had to consciously tell yourself to check your memory, consciously be aware of how much force you apply to the accelerator as you fine-tune the speed on the drive, as you also observe all of the environment that's around you. It was a very complicated task. All right. It took a lot of effort. It took a lot of deliberation. And through years of practice and experience, of course, driving becomes a much more relaxed experience because you're not responding and actively telling yourself to effortfully think about every little aspect of the drive. Okay, so such automaticity in your classroom needs to be considered as well. So we need to think about, how does the automation fit into your class, or how does the long-term memory formation fit into your class, so that you can become more purposeful in terms of the way you carve out time for practice, while still encouraging higher order thinking to develop understanding and creating associations in your kids, okay, in your students. So we're going to look into that whole circuit system in our brain. So all of these processes that we've looked at requires flexible integration of different parts of your brain. So remember, different parts of your brains looks after different, different processing information, whether it be visual, auditory, and so forth, and accessing long-term memory, etc. And they're all connected, much like an electrical circuit around your house, but of course, in a much more complicated way, or much more complex way. So we need to look at information that, for example, the circuits that connect the prefrontal cortex with the parietal cortex for working memory, or perhaps the temporal frontal connections for long-term memory storage and accessing long-term memory as well. Okay, so what is it that guides the allocation of attentional resources? What guides what facts to retrieve from memory in order to solve the numerical problem or any problem that's ahead of you? That's the big question that we need to ask. How do we access all of that information? How do we store it effectively? How do we file it away effectively in our brain so that you can access it effectively as well? Okay, so these brain circuits that we've spoken about are made of neural cells. So that's the fundamental basic units of our brain. These are specialist cells that transmit information from one nerve cell to another, all over and across the brain, depending on how it's all connected. So if we zoom in, these specialist cells actually conduct energy as a way of communicating with each other. We call this energy action potential, and this action potential is actually chemically triggered. So just like all the other cells in our body, neural cells have a cell body as well. And the cell body has cytoplasm and mitochondria, which is that energy factory in our brain. Oh, sorry, the energy factory in the cell. Now, neurons have specialized cell parts called dendrites and axons. Dendrites actually bring in the electrical signal into the cell body, and the axons then take away that information from the cell body as it goes towards the next cell body. Okay, so the axons take information away. The smooth surface of the axon, so the axon is kind of wrapped up in this insulation called the myelin sheath. And this insulation ensures that any action potential or any electrical signal that comes through is preserved as much as it possibly can, to ensure that by the time it gets passed on to the next neural cell, you don't have 10% only left to pass on. You want to, just like the electricity around your house, pass on or increase the efficiency of the transmission, if you wish. So generally there's only one axon per cell, and it kind of branches further from the cell body compared to the dendrite. But the electrochemical process that actually causes the transmission of the neurotransmitter occurs in the synapse, which is that neural junction between the two neural cells. So what we have is this situation where information gets passed on. So we bring in information from the dendrites, it gets processed into the cell, in the cell body, and then it gets passed on to the next cell. So we want to look at how efficient is this process, which then determines whether or not that information gets committed to long-term memory. Okay, so whether or not we propagate that information deep enough into the hippocampus from our frontal lobe. So the word synapse. The word synapse stems from a Greek word called syn, so S-Y-N, which means together, and another word called haptein, which means to clasp, so H-A-P-T-E-I-N, which means to clasp. Now, this might make you think that the synapse is actually, where the brain cells touch or fasten to each other, but it's not quite right. The synapse, they're actually so close together, but there is a small pocket of space between the two cells. And it's in this small pocket of space that messages are passed through. So a single neuron may actually contain thousands of synapses. So it will connect to multiple postsynaptic cells. Okay, and hence, if you think about the association, you're not just getting information being passed on to one sort of straight pathway, but all of the paths around it as well, hence the association. So neurons critically depend on mitochondrial function to make sure that the membrane, so the outside of the outside of the actual cell remains excitable. So in other words, there's still a lot of electrical energy in order to execute this complex process of neurotransmission. So you want, when it comes to neurotransmission, what that means is that neurotransmitters is actually released at the synapse, and you need to make sure that there is enough excitability, so enough electrical signal for that neurotransmitter to be released and taken up by the next cell. Okay, so synapses, as I mentioned, it is tiny. It is a tiny space. In fact, it's if scientists try to sort of measure it, or scientists have tried to measure it actually, and it's around 20 to 40 nanometer wide. So in comparison, what that means is, imagine if you have a piece of paper in front of you, the thickness of that paper is about 100,000 nanometers wide. So it's about so there's about 3,000 synapses that would actually fit in that thickness of that paper that you have in front of you. Okay, so it's a very small space, but neurotransmission, or sometimes we call it synaptic transmission, is that communication that occurs between brain cells at the synapse. So one neuron, so imagine the neuron represented here on the left, is called your presynaptic cell. And then the neuron represented on the right is your postsynaptic cell. So the presynaptic cell releases neurotransmitter into that space, and then those neurotransmitters are then picked up or absorbed by the postsynaptic cells. And when this message is passed, it has the power of actually changing the behavior of both cells, both the pre and postsynaptic cells. So it could tell, the neurochemical, depending on what neurochemical it is, it could tell if it tells the cells to slow down or to speed up, to become more active or to become less active. So it's all dependent on the actual neurotransmitter, or which neurotransmitter has been transmitted across the synapse. So neurotransmitters what they are is that they are chemical messengers that transmit the message across the synapse, right? So the target can be, either a nerve cell. In our case, it is a neural cell, but it could also be a muscle cell or a gland cell in other parts of your body. They all work in a similar way. So the whole process is very, very similar in other cells as well. But the idea here is depending on which chemical or neurotransmitter is released, different things can happen. Neurotransmitters like glutamate, GABA, dopamine, and serotonin are the 4 neurotransmitters that we are aware of that is involved in memory and memory formation or even memory alterations. Okay, but for today's webinar, what we will focus on is the efforts on of dopamine and glutamate. So the idea is if we can understand what releases dopamine or what glutamate does, we can raise our understanding on how we can better deliver and plan our lesson as well. So any questions at this stage? I'm just looking at the screen to see if anyone's asked any questions. Okay, let's move on. So if you have any questions, feel free to type it into the chat box. But to start with, I know there's a lot of information we're trying to gather, but the journey that we've come to so far is it occurs in, memories are stored in the hippocampus. And now what we're trying to understand is how do we store memory effectively? The first thing we need to look at is the glutamate neurotransmitter. Now, the glutamate neurotransmitter is associated with energy regulation. So it was discovered in the early 1950s, and glutamate has been involved in very fundamental functions like neuroplasticity, neurodevelopment, learning, and memory. So its main function is actually in providing excitation of neural cells, so creating energy in the neural cells, so that more energy is transferred and therefore information gets propagated into the right part of your brain in order to form long-term memory. So glutamate, when you look at glutamate, think of energy, okay? So getting things excited and creating more energy in our brain cells. Dopamine, on the other hand, a lot of us has heard about dopamine. So dopamine is associated with a reward-based behavior. So in fact, a variety of memory systems are actually regulated by dopamine in the brain. Dopamine's role in memory is actually derived from its prediction of the reward rather than actually feeling the reward. So it's in anticipation of the reward. So it also, as a result of that, because it is anticipating reward, it actually drives or motivates behavior. So studies have also shown that dopamine inputs are in structures like the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that deals with emotions, and the hippocampus, which is the part of our brain that stores our memory. And because of that, because its input structures is in the amygdala and the hippocampus, amongst other areas, it impacts that consolidation of memories when we learn. The most interesting find is the fact that dopamine actually affects or regulate glutamate levels. So dopamine levels, so feeling of sense of reward and anticipating a reward, can actually help excite the membrane cells so that we can propagate information. And that, as we know it, is the most, the most simplistic way of thinking about why our students need to feel rewarded when it comes to learning, because through that reward and excitement in learning, they release dopamine, and it's through the release of dopamine actually then increases the excitation in our brain cells. Okay, so once upon a time, long-term potentiation, I want us to think about this process effectively. Okay, so it wasn't that long ago that neuroscientists actually believed that all synapses were fixed and they all worked at the same level at the same time. But that view has changed. What we now understand is that activity, so electrical impulses or lack thereof, can actually strengthen or weaken the synapses. And with or without the electrical signals, or varying amounts of electrical signal, actually change the number of structural synapses in our brain. So if the brain receives more activation, so you're practicing a lot, you're reading a lot, you're doing a maths practice a lot, it can actually get stronger And when it gets stronger, it then turns into this positive energy where it can have influence over neighboring postsynaptic neurons as well. So long-term potentiation is a process in our brain whereby the synapses are actually repeatedly and persistently strengthened over time. So they're continuously trading chemical signals. So this whole process that we looked at earlier, passing information on, passing neurotransmitters on, that process keeps going. So if it keeps going, there's long-term potentiation going on, and this strengthening results in amplified response in the postsynaptic cell. And so long-term potentiation, so repetition, actually enhances cell communication, which then leads to faster and even more efficient signaling between cells at the synapse, as well as with its neighboring cells. So neuroscientists believe that long-term potentiation is that underlying mechanism for learning and memory formation. So what that means is if we keep practicing, you will actually get in the hippocampus, you'll actually get neural density, which is the strengthening of those and the strengthening of the connections in your brain, which is where long-term memory resides. Okay. So over the last 30 odd years, scientists have actually found that the input to the postsynaptic cell causes it to actually traffic even more receptors into that area as well, which further amplifies the signal. So again, what that means is this phenomenon of long-term potentiation is far more than simply activating existing receptors, but it can also amplify and create more receptors in the relevant cells, which makes your memory even stronger as well through, persistence activation. Okay, so it's pretty exciting. So we always get our students to think about, when you learn something, you don't want to just learn it. You want to keep practicing it and practicing it until you have real synapses being formed, real neural density occurring in your hippocampus related to the content that you have learned. So conversely, we can also have boredom, which creates long-term depression. So we all know, I cannot overemphasize the importance of repetitive, repeatedly practicing tasks, but keeping in mind these repetition needs to also have growth, okay? Otherwise, boredom kicks in, which has the opposite effect. So with time and effort, you get better and better at specific tasks, but you need to make sure that you are once you get better, once there is mastery at a particular level, you need to make it a little bit harder. So the questions need to adapt. So when we learn maths, for example, once there is mastery being shown, quickly move up to the next level and then master that again and move up to the next level. Otherwise, if you're just practicing at the same level, you get bored and you're not spending your time effectively. And of course, like I said, the worst case scenario is if you're doing the same thing over and over again without any changes or growth, then you can even cause synaptic pruning, so through long-term depression. Alternatively, if you remember something but you no longer practice, so at one point you practiced it over and over again, but then you stop practicing because you're no longer using it, you can also lose it. So that whole use it or lose it approach doesn't just apply to the muscles in our body, but it also applies to the brain. So neural pathways that are not used actually eventually gets pruned. So in summary, just quickly in regards to the brain, what we do know at the moment is that information, so the frontal lobe processes information, and if there is a lot of excitation, so a lot of glutamate, because glutamate potentiates energy, then it gets it travels into the hippocampus. But glutamate levels need dopamine. So we need to keep our lessons interesting and exciting and excitable. We need to keep the lessons progressive so that questions are not just at the same level, but once your students have shown mastery, they will move up to the next level in order for us to keep that long-term potentiation going, which then leads to even more memory formation as well. Okay, so like I said, remember dopamine is so important. So make sure your kids are not bored in class. Dopamine is that neurotransmitter that's in the brain that acts as that chemical transmitter or messenger between the neurons. It's released in the anticipation of reward. And when you come to associate a certain activity with pleasure, mere anticipation in itself can be enough to raise dopamine levels. So what that means is for many students and even many of us adults, learning about new things in itself is an adventure and very rewarding. So the dopamine levels is increased in the brain to help us retain that new information because we know it's new and it's exciting. Okay, so keep your classes, your lesson interesting. Attentional resource. This is really interesting because researchers have actually demonstrated that even just 1 hour of time spent playing computer games has an effect on the brain. So the research team have found that changes in the brain activity is increased in performance even just by playing 1 hour of a game. Okay, so the way that they did this test was before and after the video gameplay, the participants' visual selective attention was assessed. So visual selective attention means that your brain's ability to focus on relevant visual information while suppressing less relevant information. So it takes away, suppresses the distractions, if you wish. So the ability, so processing information uses energy, right? So the more you can focus, the more efficient and narrow you can be, and therefore using your brain more effectively. So assessing your visual selective attention is actually quite powerful. So the researchers, what they did was they briefly showed each subject a square in the center of a computer screen. Then another square actually flashed up in the different part of the screen, and the subject was actually asked to identify the position of the second square relative to the first square. So during the course of the experiment, the researchers also monitored the brain activity associated with attention using electroencephalography, so EEG. So what they found was that in the initial assessment, the expert gamers, so the gamers or the subjects that have, always played games, had more brain activity associated with attention compared to the non-experts. The experts also scored better on the initial visual selective attention assessment, but after an hour-long video game session, both the experts and the non-experts had actually improved their visual selective attention. And the two groups actually received a very similar score on the post-game assessment. So what that means is that the non-experts actually showed changes in the brain activity according to the EEG data, just even after 1 hour of gameplay. So much so that at the end of that hour, that brain activity was similar to that level of the experts. So what the researchers explain is that while these results of short, periods of gameplay show that the brain activity can actually change and improve attention skills, it is still, a far-fetched, I suppose, to necessarily say, classrooms should just implement all games. But what we do know is that if we just give them a snippet of a game, give them one session that is just all about focus and attention, it really can help our students use their brain more effectively. And we can teach them how to do, and we can teach the importance of, basically defining the efficiency or improving efficiency of brain use, which is what we really want to encourage in our kids as well. Because quite often our kids don't really know how to differentiate between what's important and what's not. So here's another study that was being done. They were playing, this is not a maths game, they were playing a Super Mario 64 video game. And what they did was they actually showed an increase in increase in size in brain regions responsible for orientation, so the parietal lobe, and memory formation and strategic planning, as well as fine motor skills as well. All right. So in comparison to the control group, the video game group actually showed increase in their gray matter in the right hippocampus, the right prefrontal cortex, and the cerebellum. And this is all measured using MRI, which is the image here. Okay. And these brain regions, so we've spoke about the hippocampus, which is memory formation or retrieval memory, as well as spatial coordination. And the prefrontal cortex, which is all about strategic planning. They were the areas of our brain that was enlarged when students were playing games. Okay, so what that means is there is blood flow that is committed to those areas to raise attention. So what does that mean in terms of possibilities in the classrooms? So what I wanted to suggest is, in a classroom, what we can see is, what if we use and insert games, not the entire day, but 30 minutes, 60 minutes within the day, and that it allows your students to practice a particular maths concept over and over again until they build long-term memory. But keeping in mind that with games, it automatically adapts. So this technology allows the system or the technology to automatically increase in difficulty level, so your students are not getting bored, so they are spending that time efficiently. So if they're not getting bored because the questions are getting harder, they're constantly being challenged, and they are doing hundreds and hundreds of questions in a short space of time. So games can be added in your classrooms effectively to help your students build memory. And the reason why, keeping in mind, the reason why we are wanting to build memory is because everything that we learn, everything that we are about to learn, relies upon us building on prior knowledge. Okay, so remember when we encountered 17 times 24. So our current process, our slow thinking, our frontal hippocampal circuits is trying to think about, all right, how do I solve this problem? But our fast thinking part of our brain, the hippocampal frontal circuits, is saying, do I use addition? Do I use single digit multiplication? Do I use some quick times tables multiplication? What process do I use? That's the fast thinking part of our brain. But it can only do that because we have committed these addition, single digit multiplication, quick times table multiplication as examples into your long-term memory. If you didn't have that, then you don't have a toolkit. You don't have your maths toolkit in order for you to grow. Same goes with worded questions. So in this case, Roger is starting up his own car dealership. He has a fleet of 18 cars. Each car costs $8,999. How much do the cars cost altogether? All right, so that is, our slow thinking part of our brain. We're trying to visualize the car. You might even use your parietal lobe to try and imagine, what color are the cars? How do they look like? What pattern are they sitting in? The 18 cars, it's probably not in a random organization. Do we use 9,000? Is it easy enough to multiply 9,000? We're trying to make some decisions. Our parietal lobe is trying to make some decisions, while our hippocampal frontal circuits is saying, okay, yep, I know this part of the information, I have access to this part of the information, and you have all of these maths toolkit that belongs in your long-term memory that you can borrow from in order to grow. Okay. You can also build on prior knowledge when, what about something that's harder? For example, if you look at vectors. Okay, again, same thing. In order to solve this vector problem, you need to look at a basic or more basic components of the problems that you need to, have learned in order for you to be able to solve these problems. So it's the same message. It's so important for our brain to then allow, in order for your brain to be able to solve those higher order thinking problems, you need to have long-term memory, and building long-term memory relies on things like the dopamine spikes, relies on instant feedback so that your brain can say, yep, that is correct, let's do another question, the feeling of reward. And that's why there are maths games that are strategically designed with real maths learning in it. Okay, but also real neuroscience based trigger points to ensure that your students are not just doing 3 or 4 questions and moving on, but in fact they are doing hundreds or perhaps even thousands of questions in order for them to become so masterful with that particular piece of content that it becomes automatic for them. Okay, so this is a game. Here's an example of a game from Manga High called Flower Power, which is all about ordering fractions, decimals, and percentages. So for your students to be able to just automatically recognize that 1.5 is bigger than is larger than 1 1/4, which is larger than 3/4. You want that to be automatic, okay? Because you don't want your students to be using their working memory, their parietal lobe, and their frontal lobe in order to try and visualize, you know, which one is larger every single time, because it tires them out very quickly. Okay, so instant feedback in a game will allow your kids to do that. And like I said earlier, if you give your students 1,000 questions and they are all at the same level, yes, they are practicing with discipline, but by the time they finish maybe the 15th or the 20th question, the rest of the 980 questions are just time killing. It does not serve the memory at all. It does not help in the growth of their brain size at all. So what we need to ensure is that any content, any technology that you use, it up levels. The questions gets more difficult for your students. They are productively struggling. And more importantly, in your classroom, if you have 30 or 40 or 50 students in your classroom, you need that learning to be a personalized journey as well, because not all students are going to be achieving at the same level at the same time. So a personalized journey will really allow your students to be able to you know, take on the journey that's most relevant to them and therefore support their learning. Mindset. Now, Carol Dweck and Joe Bowler at Stanford University has really popularized you know, this whole attitude and mindset when it comes to maths. What that means is students believe that their talents can be developed and their abilities can be built over time. We encourage our students to use mistakes to, you know, as an opportunity to help them grow, and also get students to be aware of how they learn as well. So in Manga High, just to give you an idea, all of the quizzes comes with a mapped journey, which allows your students to actually see where they've done something wrong, where they need to relearn from, and grow from there as well. Okay, so Manga High is a tool to help students develop a growth mindset. Just a quick name drop, and I'm always really proud of this quote from Bill Gates from back in 2012, when he addressed the nation about, when he addressed his group of people about, you know, the changes in education and what else is, you know, is that sort of next big thing in technology. And what he recognized is the fact that delivering fun, competitive, games-based lessons will drive greater engagement, and with that engagement we can drive better understanding as well. So I think it's really important and powerful for us all to consider, you know, how to embed this whole games-based approach, this idea of forming long-term memory in an efficient way, because we don't want our students to just keep practicing over and over again without a strategic method. So we want them to use technology to allow them to, while they're practicing, they are practicing and building their brain efficiently, because long-term memory enables growth. Without long-term memory, you're always starting at square one. So every time you learn something new, but you forget it, then you effectively haven't really learned it, or you might have only learned 10% of it. So you want our students to perform long-term memory. And of course, you need to keep your lessons interesting and exciting, and whether that be using, you know, digital games-based technology, but I would obviously recommend digital games-based technology because it allows students to receive instant feedback. It allows them to, you know, productively struggle towards harder questions. And it ensures, and of course, it ensures that your students are still staying on task. So when you are examining your technology, that you are choosing for your classroom, just make sure that the games or the technology that you have chosen has a strong foundation in the educational content that it intends to deliver. So make sure that it is not simply entertaining or babysitting our students, but it has very strong educational foundation that you can be proud of. Okay, so that's where I will leave our thoughts today. I really hope that you know, you've learned something new and it's inspired you to think about how you can adapt your lessons to make sure that our students are becoming more efficient learners. So if you want to continue any conversations, if you have any comments, feel free to email me at michelle.quay@mangohigh.com. I really appreciate the time that you've spent with me this morning. Thank you so much, and I'll stick around for a little while to take any questions. Feel free to type in, you know, any questions that you might have in your chat box, and I'd love to answer them for you. No one has any questions for me? If not, we can leave it there. What I will do is I will save this recording and share it with all of you. And please feel free to share the session and its contents with all of your staff and your colleagues. And I look forward to possibly connecting with you and discussing strategies to implement some of these you know, information that we've learned today into your classroom. Thank you so much for your time, guys. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.